Let's be honest. When he goes, there's nothing here worth fighting over. My daughter always had a soft spot for lost causes.
Please, not here.
I need your signature tonight, before things get complicated.
What papers?
Hospital paperwork. Standard.
You wouldn't know the difference. He never does. He can still hear you.
Remember your place.
My wife chose the hour of my father's dying to make her position clear. While Wesley lay in that hospital bed, Tessa stood over him like someone already calculating what came next. Her family treated his final breaths as background noise, discussing what little they expected to inherit, reminding me how far I had fallen short. When I asked them to stop, she told me to remember my place. She was already sliding papers across the bed rail. She was that certain of what I was. What would she do when she found out she was wrong? If you've ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to be in your corner, this story is for you. Subscribe and stay with this channel. We tell stories about quiet strength and what happens when it finally speaks. My father never raised his voice, not once in all the years I could remember. When other men argued over dinner tables and parking spots, Wesley Rains would simply watch, let the noise run its course, and then speak one sentence that settled the whole room. I used to think that was weakness. I spent too many years of my marriage thinking that quiet men were men who had given up. I understand now that I had it exactly backward. I had been at the hospital for 3 days straight when it became clear that the end was close. The doctors had stopped talking about recovery and started talking about comfort. My father lay in the bed with his eyes half open, his breathing shallow and uneven, and I sat beside him the way I had learned to sit in difficult rooms, still saying very little, trying not to take up too much space. That was another habit I had learned from the wrong teacher. Tessa arrived on the afternoon of the third day with her mother Marjorie and her brother Nolan. Her father Gordon came an hour later, smelling like scotch and wearing the particular expression he reserved for things he considered beneath him. I had not asked any of them to come. Tessa said she came because she was my wife and it was the right thing to do. Within 20 minutes of walking through the door, she had established what the right thing actually looked like, which was standing in the far corner of the room with her family speaking in a voice just loud enough for me to hear every word. Marjorie said that Wesley had always lived simply, which she did not mean as a compliment. She said it the way people describe someone who never quite figured things out. Nolan agreed and added that at least the hospital bills would be manageable given that there probably was not much of an estate to sort through. Gordon laughed at that, a short, satisfied sound, like a man confirming something he had always suspected. None of them looked at the bed when they spoke. They looked at each other, which I think made it easier. I kept my eyes on my father. What broke something open in me was not what they said. It was the fact that my father could hear them. His eyes tracked sound even when he could not move. I watched the small muscles around his jaw tighten when Marjorie spoke, and I understood that in whatever territory lay between sleep and death, Wesley Rains was still in there, still listening and still being forced to hear his son described as a charity case by people who had spent years eating meals in his son's home. Tessa crossed the room at some point and stood beside me with her hand on my shoulder. It looked like comfort. It felt like management. She said she had been thinking about practical matters because someone had to. She said that if her father had any accounts, any life insurance, anything at all, it would be better to understand that now rather than later when things became emotionally complicated. She used the word we several times. She meant herself. I said nothing. I had learned over years of marriage that saying nothing was sometimes the only form of dignity available to me. I told myself that was patience. I know now it was not patience. It was surrender dressed up in a quiet man's clothing. Then something changed in the room. My father opened his eyes fully. Not the half-lidded drift I had been watching for 3 days, but completely open alert in a way that made the nurse step forward and then stop. He turned his head toward Tessa with a deliberateness that cost him something visible, and when he spoke, his voice was steadier than it had any right to be. He told her he knew what she thought of his son, not what she said about his son, but what she actually thought. He said there was a difference and that he had understood the difference for a long time. Tessa began to say something about only wanting what was best for the family. Wesley looked at her the way a man looks at a door he has already decided not to open again. Then he said it. Quietly, without anger, the way he said every sentence that actually mattered. "You have no idea who you married." The machines began alarming before anyone could respond. The nurses came in fast, and then the doctors and the room became the organized chaos that hospitals are built for. I stood against the wall with my back to the window while they worked. I already knew. I think I had known from the moment his eyes opened that this was the last thing he was going to say, and that he had chosen to spend it on a warning rather than a goodbye, which told me everything about what he believed I still needed. Wesley Rains died at 4:17 in the afternoon. I know the exact time because I was looking at the clock on the wall when the lead physician turned to me with that particular expression, and the number is the kind of thing that burns itself into you without asking permission. The room went quiet in a different way after that. Even the Sutton family stopped talking. It lasted about 4 minutes. Then Tessa said that my father was gone and that I was still her husband, and that it would be better for everyone if I remembered what that meant going forward. She said it the way she said a great many things, not cruelly exactly, but with a certainty that did not leave room for another interpretation. As if she had already decided what the next chapter looked like and was simply informing me of the plot. Something shifted in me at that moment. Not loudly. There was no anger I can point to, no single decision I made. It was more like a door that had been slowly closing for a long time, finally clicked shut. I had spent years of my marriage looking for the version of Tessa that matched the woman I thought I had chosen. I stopped looking for her that afternoon. I asked them to leave. All of them. Gordon made a sound of disbelief. Nolan said something about grief making people irrational. Marjorie began explaining that family was supposed to stay together in difficult moments, which I found remarkable given the previous 3 hours. Tessa looked at me as though I had suggested something genuinely absurd. I walked to the door and held it open. When none of them moved, I went to the nurses' station and asked for security. 2 guards arrived within 3 minutes. The Sutton family left the room the way people leave rooms when they have been made to understand that the conversation is over loudly and with promises that this was not. When the door closed, I sat back down beside my father. I do not know exactly how long I sat. Long enough that the light through the window changed. Long enough that the nurse came in twice and left without speaking. I held the edge of the bed railing because it was something solid and I needed something solid, and I told my father the things that men do not say when there is still time to say them and which they have to say anyway once that time is gone. The man who knocked and entered without fully waiting was somewhere in his mid-50s in a dark suit that fit the way expensive suits fit, carrying a silver briefcase that he set carefully on the chair beside the door. He introduced himself as Adrian Mercer. He said he had been my father's attorney for over 2 decades, and that he was sorry for my loss, and that there were matters that needed to be discussed tonight if I was willing. I told him I did not know my father had an attorney. Adrian said that was entirely by design. What he told me in the next 30 minutes reorganized everything I thought I understood about my own life. My father had not been a man of modest means living a modest life. Wesley Rains had been the controlling mind behind a private investment structure called Rains Consolidated Holdings, managed through a legal vehicle called the Rains Legacy Trust. The trust held interests in real estate private equity and a range of operating businesses, all maintained through intermediaries and managed entities specifically designed to insulate Wesley's personal identity from public exposure. The total value of those assets conservatively assessed was approximately $10 billion. I made Adrian repeat the number. He did. He was patient about it. I sat with that for a moment that felt longer than it probably was. I thought about the suit my father wore to my college graduation, the one with the frayed left cuff that he had refused to replace because he said it still fit fine. I thought about the truck he drove for 11 years. I thought about the way he would turn off lights in empty rooms and make a small comment about electricity being a courtesy you extended to people who weren't home. I had thought those were the habits of a man with limited resources. I understand now that they were the habits of a man who had decided that what he owned had nothing to do with who he was. Adrian told me Wesley had set it up this way on purpose. He had wanted to know who would be in his son's life before money was any part of the equation. He had watched my marriage for years and structured the trust accordingly. The assets were held entirely in my name as sole beneficiary outside of any marital estate. He had engaged a firm of estate litigators specifically to defend that structure against challenge, and he had left instructions which Adrian now handed me in a sealed envelope about what to do when not if Tessa discovered what I had inherited. I read the letter twice. My father wrote the way he spoke, plain sentences, no decoration, nothing wasted. He told me Tessa would come back. She would be soft, apologetic, possibly tearful. She would call it love. He told me not to mistake it for love. He told me to let her show me exactly who she was before I made any move. And he told me that the worst thing I could do was respond with anger, because anger was what she was counting on. I was right. She was already in the hallway. A nurse came to tell me a woman was asking to see me, that she seemed upset and was asking for me by name, and did I want to allow it. I said yes because I wanted to see it clearly. I needed to see it clearly one final time without any story, I told myself, getting in the way. Tessa came in with her eyes red and her voice softer than I had heard it in years. She said she was sorry. She said the things people say when they are trying to reconstruct something they have broken, and she said them well enough that in another version of that evening I might have felt something shift back toward her. Instead, I felt the strange, cold clarity of a man reading a letter from his father that had predicted this scene almost word for word. She reached into her bag and brought out a set of papers. She said they were hospital forms, administrative things. She said, given everything that had happened, it would be better to have certain documents signed before things became legally complicated, and she said it with a gentleness that was almost convincing. Adrian, who had been standing quietly near the window, said he would need to review anything before I signed it. Tessa looked at him the way people look at obstacles they had not planned for. I told her I was not going to sign anything that night. I told her I was going to ask her to leave again and that this time I expected her to go without requiring a second request. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I did not entirely recognize, not anger, not grief, but something more careful and more deliberate, as though she was recalculating rather than reacting. Then she left. I looked at Adrian. He looked at me. He said we had a great deal of work to do in the days ahead and that my father had planned for every scenario we were likely to face. I looked at the bed where my father had been. The man I had underestimated my entire life had spent that same life making sure I would not be left without armor when the people around me finally showed me what they were made of. I had just watched it begin. The morning after my father died, Tessa was a different person. Not different in the way grief changes people, softer, quieter, stripped of their usual performances. Different in the way a chess player is different when they realize the board has shifted and the opening they prepared no longer applies. She called me twice before 8 in the morning. The first call she was warm. The second warmer, still her voice carrying that particular tenderness she had always been able to produce on short notice when she needed something from me. She said we should face this together. She said she was my wife. She said the word together 4 times in a 3-minute conversation, which told me exactly how alone she expected me to be in whatever came next. I let her talk. I did not tell her about Adrian. I did not tell her about the trust. I said I needed time, and I meant it, just not in the way she understood it. Adrian arrived at my father's house that morning with 2 colleagues from his firm. We spent several reviewing documents, transfer protocols, and the specific legal architecture Wesley had built over 2 decades to ensure that what he had constructed could not be dismantled by a single bad marriage. Adrian was methodical and unhurried, which I was beginning to understand was a quality my father had selected for deliberately. Wesley had not chosen people who moved fast. He had chosen people who moved right. What Adrian told me about Tessa's legal exposure was precise. The Raines Legacy Trust was structured as a separate property instrument predating the marriage by more than 15 years. Under the terms, Wesley had established any attempt by a spouse to coerce, manipulate, or obtain by fraud any benefit from the trust would trigger a permanent restriction clause, meaning Tessa would not simply receive less. She would be legally barred from making any claim against the trust at all. The hospital papers she had tried to get me to sign were Adrian confirmed after reviewing them, an attempt to establish a financial power of attorney over my affairs while I was in a state of acute grief. Had I signed them, she would have had a basis to argue she was entitled to act on my behalf in matters involving any inheritance. She had known exactly what she was doing. She had prepared those papers before my father drew his last breath. I sat with that for a long time after Adrian left the room. I thought about all the years I had spent telling myself that Tessa's sharpness was just her personality, that her control was just her anxiety, that the distance between us was something I had contributed to equally. There is a particular kind of self-deception that feels like fairness, and I had practiced it for a long time. I was done practicing it. That same night, while I was at my father's house with Adrian, Tessa made a different kind of move. I learned about it later from Adrian's investigator, who had been quietly watching at my father's request since the day Wesley entered the hospital. Tessa had spent the evening on the phone with a family law attorney named Raymond Holt, one of the more aggressive divorce litigators in the city. She had not called him in tears. She had not called him confused or overwhelmed. She had laid out the situation calmly in sequence and asked him specifically about asset protection strategies, the timeline for filing emergency motions, and whether a claim of emotional abuse could be used to establish grounds for temporary financial control. Raymond Holt had answered her questions. She had taken notes. This was not a woman in grief. This was a woman executing a plan she had begun constructing the moment she heard the word attorney in that hospital corridor. When Tessa realized she had no path through Adrian, she found a different route entirely. I came home the following afternoon to find the lock on the front door showing fresh scratch marks around the cylinder. Inside the small fireproof cabinet in the study where my father had kept personal documents and the few items of genuine sentimental value he owned had been pried open. The old watch he had worn every day for 30 years was gone. The letters he had written to me over the years were gone. The cross he had given me the day I graduated college was gone. I was still standing in the doorway of the study when I heard movement from the back of the house. Tessa was in my father's old bedroom going through the filing cabinet in the corner, a stack of documents spread across the bed beside her old bank statements, a property record, and the original marriage certificate. She looked up when I appeared in the doorway with the particular expression of someone who had been caught doing something they had decided in advance to justify. She said she was just trying to understand what we were dealing with. She said she had every right to be there. She used "we," again, that word she had been carrying like a shield since the hospital, as though the plural would make her presence feel less like what it was. I told her she needed to leave. I told her that what she had taken from the cabinet needed to be returned, and that what she had done constituted something I would be discussing with my attorney. She straightened and looked at me with that recalibrating expression again, not guilt, but the careful measurement of someone deciding whether to escalate or retreat. She retreated. But I had learned enough to know that retreat was just repositioning. My father's funeral was held 4 days after his death. Adrian had carried out arrangements Wesley had made himself years before with the same quiet thoroughness he brought to everything. I did not know what to expect. I had spent my adult life believing my father was a man of modest profile, and I expected a small gathering. A few neighbors, perhaps some people from the church he attended when I was a boy. What arrived instead was something I could not have anticipated. The cars filled the lot and spilled down the block. Men and women in good suits, people with the kind of stillness that comes from real authority, filled the pews of the church until there was standing room only. I recognized faces from newspapers and from the kind of quiet industry gatherings that don't get covered by newspapers. I saw a former federal judge. I saw 2 people whose names were on buildings in the downtown corridor. I did not know my father knew these people. Based on the way they spoke about him carefully with genuine weight, they had known him for a very long time. Gordon Sutton stood near the back of the church, looking like a man who had arrived to a poker game and discovered he had been playing the wrong cards for years. Marjorie stood beside him, saying nothing. Nolan kept checking his phone. Tessa stood with them, her face arranged in the correct configuration of grief, but her eyes moving over the room, the way eyes move when they are doing math. I spoke during the service. I talked about what my father had taught me, not the lessons he delivered formally, but the ones embedded in the way he lived. I said that the most important thing he ever showed me was that when a person reveals their true character, the most respectful thing you can do is believe them. I said that some people had used the final hours of his life as an opportunity, and that he had seen them clearly, and that I had too. I did not use any names. By the time I finished, half the church had turned their attention toward the row where the Sutton family stood, at the graveside. Tessa made one final attempt at the performance she had been rehearsing. She positioned herself near me, touched my arm at the right moments, projected exactly the right degree of muted devastation. I let it run until the last prayer was finished, and then I told her quietly enough that only she could hear that she was no longer welcome in anything that had belonged to my father. She stepped back and looked at me with the anger she had been keeping underneath everything else, and then she made a mistake. She said loudly enough for the people standing nearest to us to hear that she was my wife, and that whatever was his was ours, and that she would make sure of that through whatever means were available to her. Several people turned. A few of them had been in that church for 20 years on my father's quiet invitation, and they had just heard Tessa Raines make a territorial claim over a grave. That was the last thing she said to me in person for a long time. Just past midnight that same night, Dana Prescott called. She was the senior administrator of the Raines Legacy Trust appointed by Wesley years before his death to manage the operational transition once it was triggered. Her voice was calm and precise, the voice of someone who dealt in large numbers without letting them alter her composure. She confirmed the death certificate had been processed and verified, and that the trust was now fully active. She confirmed that I held sole controlling interest over assets valued at approximately $10 billion, and she said the phrase with the same measured calm she might use to describe the weather. Adrian called 10 minutes later with a second piece of information. The actions Tessa had taken, the coerced signing attempt at the hospital, the unauthorized entry into the house. The removal of property from the estate had met the specific criteria outlined in Wesley's trust documents. The permanent restriction clause had been triggered. Whatever legal argument Tessa's attorney constructed from this point forward, she had no path to the trust. Wesley had sealed that door before he died, and Tessa had locked it herself without knowing the mechanism existed. 3 days after the funeral, Tessa filed for divorce. The filing was not the action of a grieving wife. It was the opening move of someone who had spent the interval preparing a case. The petition listed requests for temporary possession of the house, spousal support, access to all assets, a restraining order against me on grounds of emotional abuse, and a motion to freeze any inheritance pending the outcome of proceedings. Raymond Holt had been thorough. The more dangerous element was what accompanied the filing: a dossier containing photographs, text message excerpts stripped of their surrounding context, and 2 written declarations from acquaintances who had not been present for any of the events they described. One claimed I had a pattern of isolating Tessa from her family. The other described me as emotionally volatile. Both declarations used language too similar, structured too cleanly to have been written independently. This had not been assembled in 3 days. Portions of it had been in preparation for much longer. I took the documents to Adrian and laid them on the table in front of him. He read through them without expression. When he finished, he told me that my father had considered this possibility specifically, and that the evidence Adrian's firm had been compiling since the day Wesley entered the hospital would dismantle each element of the dossier methodically and in public. I was not afraid of losing the case. I had already lost the things that actually mattered, the years I spent diminishing myself in a marriage that had never been what I believed it was. The quiet compliance I had dressed up as patience, the version of my father I had never fully seen while he was alive. What I was afraid of was becoming in the middle of all this, the kind of man Tessa had always accused me of being, reactive, driven by pride, willing to cause damage just to establish that I could. My father's letter had been very clear on this point. He had written it knowing I would be sitting exactly where I was sitting. He had told me that the worst thing a man can do with real power is use it to prove he has it. I decided to let the court hear everything, all of it, every piece of evidence Adrian had gathered in order without embellishment. I would not go after Tessa. I would simply let the truth be louder than her story. That was the choice I made, sitting at my father's kitchen table at 2 in the morning with a cup of cold coffee and a view of the backyard where he had taught me to throw a baseball 40 years ago. It felt like the first completely free decision I had made in a very long time. The emergency hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning 9 days after my father's funeral. The night before the hearing, a courier arrived at my door with a box from Tessa's attorney, the items ordered returned from the estate submitted ahead of the court's 72-hour deadline. Complying early was almost certainly a calculated gesture, something Raymond Holt had advised to demonstrate good faith before the judge. I opened the box and found the letters, the cross, and my father's watch wrapped in a cloth the way you wrap something you want someone to think you handled carefully. I set the watch on the nightstand and did not sleep well, but I slept. I had not slept well in any of those 9 days following my father's death. But I had slept. I want to be clear about that because it matters to me not as a point of pride, but as evidence of something I was only beginning to understand about myself. The man I had been 2 years earlier, even 1 year earlier, would have spent those nights cycling through every version of the argument, rehearsing responses to accusations not yet made, wearing himself down before the fight began. Instead, I had done what Adrian asked me to do, reviewed the evidence, confirmed the facts I could personally attest to, and then set it all down. My father had spent 20 years preparing for this. The least I could do was trust the work he had left behind. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Wood paneling, fluorescent lighting, the particular smell of a room where difficult things are said with practiced neutrality. Tessa arrived before me. She was wearing a gray dress I had never seen before, understated, appropriate, the kind of thing chosen with deliberate care to communicate a specific image. Her eyes were slightly red at the rims. Raymond Holt sat beside her, arranging papers with the efficiency of a man who had done this many times and believed the morning would go according to his plan. When the judge entered and the session was called to order, Holt went first. He described Tessa as a devoted wife of many years who had been abruptly abandoned by a husband changed beyond recognition by unexpected inheritance. He used the phrase emotional cruelty twice in his opening, attaching it to specific moments that bore just enough resemblance to things that had actually happened that a person without full context might have believed them. He told the judge that Desmond Raines had shut his wife out of all financial discussions, had used his attorney to create a barrier between Tessa and her legal rights as a spouse, and had behaved in a manner consistent with a pattern of psychological control. Then Holt submitted the dossier. I watched the judge review the first pages, the photographs, the excerpted messages, the 2 written declarations. Holt narrated each item with quiet confidence, the way a man narrates something he believes is already decided. There was a moment, brief but real, when I felt the specific vertigo of watching a false version of your own life presented as fact to a person with authority over your future. The declarations in particular were well written. They had the texture of first-hand witness. They were precise about dates, locations, and emotional details. If you did not know they were constructed, they would have read as credible. Adrian let Holt finish without interruption. Then he stood, and he was unhurried in the way my father's people were always unhurried, and he began dismantling. He did not open with an argument. He opened with the hospital's own security log time-stamped and certified covering the 72 hours preceding Wesley Raines's death. He walked the judge through it entry by entry when each member of the Sutton family had entered the ward, what the attending nurse's written notes reflected about the atmosphere in the room, and the specific moment at which security personnel had been called to remove visitors from a patient's private room. The nurse's signed statement was read into the record. The security officer's account was read into the record. Neither had been coached. Both had been watching. Then Adrian addressed the papers Tessa had brought to the hospital the night of Wesley's death. He did not describe them as suspicious. He let the documents describe themselves, the full text of what Tessa had asked me to sign, which established a financial power of attorney that would have granted her authority over any assets I received through inheritance. He presented the time-stamp on the document's creation, which predated my father's death by 4 days. He asked the judge to consider what that timeline meant in the context of a woman who claimed she had been blindsided by her husband's behavior. The room was very quiet by this point. The forced entry into my father's house was documented through photographs of the lock mechanism assessed by a licensed locksmith alongside the fireproof cabinet's damaged latch. The items removed were confirmed through my own testimony and supported by a photograph Wesley himself had taken of the cabinet's contents years earlier, stored digitally with Adrian's firm as part of the estate documentation process. My father had photographed his own possessions as evidence. He had done this long before he died. He had known. Then Adrian turned to the dossier. The first declaration stated that the witness had observed me behaving in a controlling manner toward Tessa at a dinner gathering on a specific date. Adrian produced a phone record and a building entry log showing that the witness had been in a different city on that date attending a professional conference for which he had registered and checked in. The declaration was false on its face, provable by data the witness had generated himself. The second declaration described an incident at a mutual friend's home in which I had allegedly raised my voice at Tessa in front of guests. Adrian produced a signed statement from the homeowner confirming that no such gathering had taken place on that date, that Tessa had not been to the home in over a year, and that the declarant had not been present at any event held there in recent memory. The homeowner had come forward voluntarily after seeing Tessa's name in the news coverage of the estate story. The fabricated dossier, which had taken days to assemble, came apart in under an hour. The judge looked at Tessa's table. Holt was writing something. Tessa sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the surface in front of her. The judge asked Holt whether he wished to respond to the evidentiary challenges. Holt said he would need time to review the materials. The judge said they would proceed with the factual record as presented. Then the judge addressed Tessa directly. She asked whether Tessa's primary motivation in seeking emergency relief was the protection of the marital relationship or the protection of her access to the assets Desmond had inherited. What happened next was the thing my father had warned me about in his letter. Not as a prediction of something bad, but as a prediction of something clarifying. He had written that the moment would come when Tessa stopped performing and simply told the truth, and that when that moment arrived it would not feel like victory. It would feel like grief. Tessa looked up from the table and said that she was his wife. She said she had given years to this marriage. She said that whatever his father had accumulated, she deserved a share of it. She did not say it with anger. She said it with the flat certainty of someone who had stopped bothering to frame her position in softer language, because the softer language had stopped working and she had nothing left to hide behind. The mask was gone. What remained was the only true thing she had said in that courtroom all morning. The judge ruled without delay. The request for temporary possession of the house was denied. The motion to freeze the trust assets was denied on the grounds that the Raines Legacy Trust was a separately structured instrument with no marital estate nexus, and that the triggering of its restriction clause was a matter of documentary record. The request for spousal support was not granted. Based on the evidence of forced entry removal of property and the coercive document presented at the hospital, the court issued an emergency protective order in my favor. Tessa was prohibited from contacting me directly from entering any property associated with the Raines estate and was ordered to maintain all further communication through counsel. Raymond Holt gathered his papers with the expression of a man who would be having a difficult conversation with his client in private. I did not feel what I thought I would feel. There was no rush of satisfaction, no sense of justice arriving the way you imagined it at 2 in the morning. What I felt was something quieter and heavier, the specific weight of an ending that had been coming for a long time finally arriving. Adrian walked with me to the car. Before I got in, he reached into the silver briefcase and handed me a second envelope. He said my father had left instructions that this letter was to be given to me after the first legal proceeding concluded regardless of outcome. I read it in the back of the car while Adrian drove. My father wrote that if things had gone the way he expected, which they had, I was probably sitting with something complicated. He said winning an argument is not the same as being free of it. He said the danger after a moment like this was spending the rest of my life measuring my choices against what Tessa had done, letting her behavior remain the fixed point around which my decisions orbited. He said that was not freedom. That was just a longer form of the same prison. He wrote, defeat her with the truth, then walk away from all of it. The greatest revenge is not making someone suffer. The greatest revenge is living without them in your head. I folded the letter and held it. Outside the window, the city moved, the way cities move indifferently, continuously, without any particular awareness of the fact that something had just ended in a small wood-paneled room a few miles back. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out my father's watch returned the previous evening in that box from Holt's office. I had carried it with me rather than worn it, not quite ready to put it on until I knew what the morning would bring. Now I put it on. The band was worn soft from 30 years on my father's wrist, and it fit the way things fit when they were always meant to be yours. I thought about what Wesley had chosen. Not the money, not the structure, not the $10 billion carefully shielded behind layers of legal architecture. I thought about the choice he had made decades earlier to live as though none of it existed. He had driven a truck for 11 years and turned off lights in empty rooms and worn a suit with a frayed cuff because he had decided that who he was had nothing to do with what he owned. He had wanted me to know that too. He had wanted me to live it before I could claim it. I asked Adrian to file for the divorce completion as quickly as the process allowed. He said he would begin the paperwork that afternoon. Then I asked him to arrange an introduction to the senior leadership team at Raines Consolidated Holdings. I had decisions to make and work my father had left behind that I intended to honor not because of the money, but because Wesley Raines had spent his life building something with a purpose that went beyond wealth accumulation, and he had chosen me to carry it forward, and I did not intend to waste that choice on bitterness. Tessa had believed she married a man without resources, without backbone, without the will to stand up for himself. She had shaped years of her behavior around that belief. She had been wrong about all of it, but the thing she had been most wrong about was the simplest she had assumed that a quiet man was an empty one. My father had been the proof that she had it backwards. I was going to spend the rest of my life being the second proof. The car turned onto the highway, and the city opened up around us wide and loud and indifferent the way it always was, the way it would continue to be long after Tessa and the dossier with its false declarations had dissolved into the background noise of a chapter I was finished with. The words I needed came without effort. The Raines legacy does not end with pain. It begins with purpose. My father would have approved of that sentence not because it was eloquent, but because it was short and true and said exactly one thing without wasting a single word. That was how he had always talked. It turned out that was how I had always wanted to talk too. I had just needed enough silence around me to finally hear myself. If this story stayed with you, it's probably because you felt something like it. The pressure to stay small, to accept less than you deserved, to confuse patience with surrender. Wesley Raines spent his life proving that quiet strength is still strength. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe to this channel. We'll be here every time you need a reminder that the people who underestimate you are the ones who have no idea what's coming.